My name is Richard. I am a 70-year-old retired structural engineer, and I live in a quiet cedar wood sanctuary right on the edge of Lake Minnetonka in Minnesota. For decades, I built foundations for skyscrapers, pouring my sweat into concrete and steel, while my heart stayed back home with my late wife, Martha, and our son, Lucas. If you are just starting to watch this story now, take a deep breath because what I am about to tell you is something I never imagined would happen in my own house under my own roof in the sanctuary I built for my twilight years. What I found out completely changed my life, and maybe it will change yours too, especially if you are a parent who has sacrificed everything for your family. Sometimes we think we know the people closest to us, but there are hidden things that only come to light when we least expect them. If you are connecting with my story, please hit the like button to bring a little sunshine to this father's heart. Subscribe to the channel so you do not miss my next life stories, and tell me in the comments where you are watching this video from and what time it is there right now. It makes me really happy to know which corner of the country or the world is listening to me and what time of day it is for you. It all started on a crisp Tuesday morning. I was standing in my kitchen, the smell of freshly brewed dark roast coffee mixing with the scent of the pine trees outside. The sun was just rising over the pristine waters of Lake Minnetonka, casting a golden glow across the living room. This house, a $1.2 million sanctuary, was not just real estate to me. It was the physical embodiment of a lifetime of grueling hard work. It was purchased with the absolute last of my retirement savings and the life insurance policy of my late wife, Martha. We had dreamed of this exact view for 40 years. When she passed away, I bought it to honor her memory, to finally find the peace we had always talked about. Then the phone rang, shattering the morning silence. I did not even get the chance to say hello the instant I swiped the screen to answer the shrill, screeching voice of my daughter-in-law. Victoria blasted through the speaker. She did not say good morning. She did not ask how I was doing. She launched a verbal hand grenade right into my living room. My parents lost their lease, she barked, her tone dripping with absolute entitlement. They are moving into your lake house at the end of the month. If you do not like it, sell it. I pulled the phone slightly away from my ear, letting her sharp words echo off my vaulted wood ceilings. Most people would have yelled back. Most fathers would have demanded respect, or at least an explanation. But I did not raise my voice. I did not react with anger. I simply stood there perfectly still, taking a slow, measured sip of my black coffee while looking out over the calm lake water. Context is a powerful weapon, and Victoria lacked it entirely. She looked at me and saw a 70-year-old man with gray hair who spent his days reading books and fishing off the dock. She thought a retired widower was a pushover. She assumed that because I was quiet, I was weak. But she forgot what I did for a living. As a structural engineer, my entire career was based on calculating pressure, bearing massive weight, and understanding exactly how and when things break. I spent my life dealing with unyielding steel and solid concrete. I do not break under pressure. Victoria was waiting for a fight. I could hear her heavy breathing on the other end of the line, bracing herself for an argument, so she could play the victim and complain to my son about how unreasonable I was being. I decided to give her absolutely nothing to work with. "All right," I replied in a completely flat, emotionless tone. Then I hung up the phone. I set the device face down on the granite counter. Victoria probably thought she had just won the lottery. She probably smiled, thinking she had conquered my territory and bullied the old man into submission. But the heavy silence that settled back over my house was not the sound of defeat. It was the calm before a highly calculated demolition. I knew the immediate fallout was coming, and sure enough, it arrived the very next afternoon. I was sitting on the front porch, pretending to read the daily newspaper, when my son Lucas pulled his expensive imported luxury SUV into my gravel driveway. He threw the car into park and stepped out, and even from 40 feet away I could see that the boy was an absolute wreck. Lucas was wearing a custom-tailored designer suit, but he was sweating right through the expensive fabric. He loosened his silk tie, his chest heaving as he stumbled up the wooden steps of the porch. He looked like a man walking straight to the gallows. "Hey, Dad," he stammered, offering a weak, trembling smile. I folded my newspaper and looked up at him over my reading glasses. I invited him inside, poured him a glass of ice water, and sat across from him at the kitchen island. I let him squirm in the silence for a full minute before he finally launched into his heavily rehearsed speech. "Dad, listen about Victoria calling you yesterday. She was just really stressed out from work. You know how she gets when she is overwhelmed." She did not mean to sound so harsh on the phone. It is just that Gerald and Patricia are in a tight spot. They only need to stay here for 3 months. Just 3 short months while their condo in the city is being remodeled. The contractors found some plumbing issues and they just need a temporary place to crash. I nodded slowly, keeping my expression entirely neutral. I played the role perfectly. The oblivious, forgiving, gentle old father who just wanted to help his family. I told him that I understood that family is supposed to step up when things get difficult, and that I would make the guest rooms available. The physical relief that washed over my son was pathetic to witness. He let out a massive breath, his shoulders slumping, as if he had just dropped 100-pound weight. But I was observing him with the analytical eye of an engineer. When you spend decades looking for stress fractures in concrete pillars, you learn to spot the signs of a rotting foundation. And my son was rotting from the inside out. While he spoke, Lucas could not hold my gaze for more than a second. His eyes kept darting away, looking at the floor, the ceiling, the refrigerator. His hands were trembling so violently that he had to keep them flat on the countertop just to steady himself. He was breathing too fast, and he kept swallowing hard. My son was lying to my face, and he was absolutely terrified. I patted him on the shoulder, told him not to worry about a thing, and walked him back out to the front door. He was in such a desperate hurry to escape my presence that he practically ran to his vehicle. As he pulled his keys from his suit pocket, a crumpled piece of yellow paper slipped out, caught the breeze, and fluttered onto the hardwood floor of the entryway. Lucas did not notice. He slammed the front door behind him, scrambled into his SUV, and sped down the driveway, kicking up a cloud of white dust. I stood in the quiet hallway and stared down at the crumpled yellow paper. A cold, heavy sensation began to pool in my stomach. I slowly bent down and picked it up, smoothing out the wrinkles. It was a receipt. A carbon copy receipt from a commercial logistics and moving company. I read the itemized list, my mind instantly processing the logistics. The receipt was paid in full, reserving 2 commercial-sized 26-foot U-Haul trucks, along with a team of professional movers wrapping materials and heavy lifting equipment. I stared out the window at the empty driveway, the truth sinking its teeth into my heart. Why would a simple, temporary 3-month stay require 2 massive commercial moving trucks? You do not pack up your entire life, your heavy appliances, and your large furniture for a brief vacation while your plumbing is being fixed. You only move that much cargo when you are abandoning your old life entirely. You only bring 2 commercial trucks when you have absolutely no intention of ever leaving. I stood there in the quiet hallway with that crumpled piece of yellow paper in my hand, listening to the fading sound of the vehicle rushing away from my property. The silence that followed was heavy, pressing down on my shoulders like a physical weight. I read the itemized list on the carbon copy receipt. Again, my mind automatically shifting back into the analytical mode that had defined my entire career as a structural engineer. 2 26-foot commercial trucks. 4 professional movers scheduled for a full 8-hour day. Heavy appliance dollies. Wardrobe boxes. Furniture wrapping materials. The sheer volume of logistics laid out on that thin piece of paper told a story that completely contradicted the nervous, sweating performance my son had just delivered in my kitchen. A temporary 3-month stay while a condo underwent plumbing repairs would require a few suitcases, maybe a few boxes of personal items, and perhaps a small rented van at most. It was a simple equation. The variables did not match the outcome Lucas had presented to me. He had stood right there drinking my ice water, looking everywhere but at my face, and fed me a plausible lie designed to keep me docile and compliant. He was banking on the hope that I was just a lonely, naive old man who would open his doors without asking any difficult questions. But a father knows his son, and an engineer knows when the math is fundamentally flawed. I walked slowly into the living room and sat down in the leather recliner that Martha had bought for me on my 60th birthday. The leather was worn and familiar, offering a small comfort in a moment where everything else felt suddenly unstable. I closed my eyes and pictured Lucas as a little boy. He used to be so painfully honest. When he was 8 years old, he broke a window in the garage with a baseball. Before I even noticed the shattered glass, he came to me with tears in his eyes and confessed, ready to accept his punishment. I had been so proud of his integrity that day. I had patted his shoulder and told him that a man is only as good as his word, and that as long as he told the truth, we could fix any broken thing together. But the man who had just practically run out of my house was not that boy anymore. Over the past 5 years of his marriage to Victoria, I had watched my son slowly erode. It was not a sudden collapse, but a gradual wearing down of his character, much like water slowly eating away at a limestone foundation. Victoria was demanding, entitled, and relentlessly critical. She wore him down with constant complaints and impossible standards. And Lucas, rather than standing firm, had chosen the path of least resistance. He became compliant. He became quiet. And now, as I held the moving company receipt, I realized he had become something much worse. He had become an active participant in his wife and her deception. My gut feeling had been right all along. When you spend decades inspecting concrete pillars and steel beams, you learn that the most dangerous cracks are not always the ones on the surface. The most dangerous structural failures happen deep inside where no one is looking, until the entire building suddenly gives way. Lucas was rotting from the inside out. His trembling hands, his darting eyes, his rapid breathing, these were the stress fractures of a man carrying a massive burden of guilt. He knew what he was doing was wrong. He knew he was betraying his own father to appease his wife and her parasitic parents, Gerald and Patricia. Yet he did it anyway. I stood up from the recliner and walked through the house, seeing my sanctuary through a completely new lens. This cedar wood home on the lake was not just a piece of real estate. It was a monument to a lifetime of hard work, long hours, and careful savings. It was the physical embodiment of the promise I had made to Martha, to finally find peace in our twilight years. Every corner of this house held a memory. The custom oak bookshelves I had built with my own hands. The antique rugs we had spent months searching for at estate sales. The large bay windows that perfectly framed the morning sunrise over the calm water. Victoria and her parents did not see a home. They saw an asset. They saw a free ride. They looked at a 70-year-old widower and saw a soft target. I walked into the kitchen and picked up the phone. The receipt had a local number printed at the top for the logistics company. I dialed the number, keeping my expression entirely neutral, even though there was no one around to see it. A cheerful customer service representative answered on the second ring. I gave her the confirmation number printed on the yellow paper, claiming I was calling on behalf of my son to confirm the details of the upcoming move. She was more than happy to help. She verified the scheduled date, the 2 commercial trucks, and the assigned crew. Then I asked a simple, casual question about the destination address, just to be absolutely certain. She confirmed my address. My quiet lake house. Then she added a specific detail that made the cold sensation in my stomach freeze into solid ice. She cheerfully noted that the clients had opted for the premium unpacking service because they were relocating permanently and wanted their heavy furniture professionally assembled in the new permanent residence. Relocating permanently. There it was. The absolute, undeniable truth spoken through a cheerful stranger on the phone. There was no condo remodel. There was no 3-month temporary stay. Gerald and Patricia were moving in for good. They were planning to take over my home, push me into the background, and live off my life savings. And my own son was the one holding the door open for them. I thanked the woman on the phone and hung up the receiver. The silence in the house felt entirely different now. It was no longer heavy with sorrow. It was sharp with purpose. My grandfatherly warmth, the forgiving nature of a loving father who just wanted his family to be happy, evaporated completely. In its place, a cold, calculated clarity took full control over my racing mind. I was a structural engineer. I knew how to build things to last, but I also knew exactly where to strike to bring a structure completely down. Lucas and Victoria thought they were moving chess pieces around a board, outsmarting an old man who would just roll over and accept his fate. But they had made a fatal miscalculation. They had forgotten that I designed massive foundations for enormous skyscrapers. I understood leverage pressure and the absolute finality of a calculated demolition. I slowly folded the yellow receipt and placed it securely inside my leather wallet. The entire game had suddenly changed, and I was now ready to play it on my own very specific terms. 3 days passed since I found that moving receipt. I spent those 72 hours doing what any good engineer does before a demolition. I surveyed the site. I walked through the quiet rooms of my cedar wood sanctuary, tracing my fingers over the custom oak bookshelves I had built, looking out the large bay windows at the calm waters of Lake Minnetonka. I was calculating the weight of the incoming storm, reinforcing my own internal foundation to withstand the impact. I knew the invasion was coming, but knowing and witnessing are two very different things. It happened on a Thursday morning. I was sitting at the kitchen island drinking my dark roast coffee and reading the daily newspaper, enjoying the serene quiet of the lake house. Suddenly, the heavy oak front door swung open without so much as a polite knock. Victoria marched into my home as if she held the deed in her hand, her high heels clicking sharply against the polished hardwood floors. She was not alone. Trailing close behind her was a tall, overly groomed man carrying a leather portfolio and an expensive-looking tablet. Victoria did not greet me. She did not even look in my direction. She walked right past the kitchen island, completely ignoring my presence, and began waving her hands in the air, pointing at the walls and ceilings. She was already treating my home like a blank canvas for her own selfish desires, a property she had already conquered. I slowly folded my newspaper and watched them over the rim of my reading glasses, keeping my breathing steady and my expression entirely blank. The man with the tablet was furiously taking notes as Victoria dictated her demands. She pointed to the load-bearing wall separating the living room and the kitchen, casually declaring that it needed to be torn down to create an open-concept flow for her mother. I felt a cold amusement at her ignorance. You cannot simply remove a load-bearing wall without compromising the structural integrity of the entire house, but Victoria only cared about appearances, not foundations. She was a woman who built her entire life on superficial facades, completely oblivious to the mechanics of how things actually stand strong. They continued their arrogant tour through my sanctuary, leaving a trail of disrespect in their wake. I followed them at a quiet distance, my footsteps silent on the antique rugs, observing the sheer audacity of my daughter-in-law. She criticized the lighting fixtures. She mocked the rustic charm of the exposed cedar beams. She spoke about my home with a level of contempt that was physically sickening to witness. But the true breaking point, the moment that extinguished any lingering trace of mercy I might have held for her, occurred when they reached the enclosed back patio. Victoria stood in front of the massive glass doors that looked out over the backyard. Just beyond the glass, bathed in the morning sunlight, was a vibrant, meticulously cared-for patch of earth. It was Martha's memorial garden. When my wife passed away, I spent an entire spring digging into that soil with my own 2 hands. I planted her favorite blue hydrangeas, white roses, and delicate climbing vines. I placed a small stone bench in the center, where I would sit on quiet evenings and talk to her. It was sacred ground. It was the heart of this property. Victoria pointed a manicured finger directly at the blooming hydrangeas. The designer stepped up beside her, holding his tablet ready. "We are going to completely level that area," Victoria announced, her voice echoing sharply against the glass. My mother has always wanted a luxury spa bathroom with a freestanding soaking tub and a sauna. We can rip out all those messy bushes and extend the foundation outward. It will give Patricia the perfect view of the lake while she relaxes. The interior designer nodded enthusiastically, completely unaware of the emotional weight of the soil they were planning to excavate. He tapped his screen, sketching out the destruction of my wife's memory, as if it were nothing more than a minor landscaping inconvenience. I stood in the hallway, my hands resting casually in the pockets of my trousers. Inside my pockets. My fists were clenched so tightly that my fingernails were cutting into my own palms. The disrespect was profound, absolute, and entirely deliberate. Victoria knew exactly what that garden meant to me. She knew how much time I spent out there tending to the flowers. She was not just planning a renovation. She was actively trying to erase Martha's memory from the property. She wanted to strip away everything that tethered me to this home, leaving me isolated, marginalized, and completely dependent on her false charity. The sheer cruelty of her plan was staggering, but it also crystallized my resolve. A weak man would have screamed. A foolish man would have thrown them out right then and there, showing his hand and losing the element of surprise. But an engineer understands patience. I took a slow, deep breath, releasing the tension from my shoulders, and stepped out of the shadows of the hallway. I approached them with a calm, measured stride, my face an impenetrable mask of polite indifference. "Excuse me, gentlemen," keeping my voice smooth and perfectly even. I extended my hand toward the interior designer. "I do not believe we have been formally introduced. I am Richard, the owner of this home. May I please have one of your business cards?" The designer looked slightly startled, glancing nervously between Victoria and me. He quickly reached into his tailored jacket, pulled out a sleek embossed card, and handed it to me. I took it, examining the elegant font before carefully slipping it into my shirt pocket. Victoria let out a sharp, condescending laugh. She crossed her arms over her chest and looked at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated smugness. "Do not worry about the noise of the construction, Richard," she said, her voice dripping with venomous sweetness. "The old man will be moving down to the basement by the end of the week. It is much quieter down there. Out of the way." I looked directly into Victoria's eyes. I saw the arrogance, the greed, the certainty that she had already won. She genuinely believed she had reduced me to a helpless spectator in my own life. I did not argue. I did not defend my territory. I simply offered her a polite, grandfatherly smile. "That sounds perfectly fine, Victoria," I replied softly. "I am sure you have everything completely figured out." I turned and walked away, heading back toward the kitchen to finish my coffee. Victoria smirked, turning back to the designer to continue her ruthless planning. She thought my polite smile was a white flag of surrender. She thought I was accepting my fate, preparing to quietly fade away into the dark, damp basement. But as I walked away, my mind was already drawing up the meticulous, unforgiving blueprints of her absolute destruction. I was going to dismantle her entire selfish world piece by piece until absolutely nothing remained of it. I walked away from the enclosed back patio with the bitter taste of dark roast coffee and profound betrayal lingering in my mouth. I left Victoria and her expensive interior designer behind the glass doors, pointing at the load-bearing walls and sketching the destruction of my late wife's memorial garden. My polite smile had completely vanished the second I turned my back to them. I needed air. I needed to step out of that house before the calculated restraint I had spent my entire life mastering finally snapped. I walked out the heavy oak front door and stepped onto the wooden porch, letting the crisp Minnesota wind hit my face. The morning sun was climbing higher over Lake Minnetonka, reflecting off the water like shattered glass. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the scent of pine and cold, fresh water, grounding myself in the physical reality of the sanctuary I had built. I walked down the long gravel driveway toward the main road. The crunch of my leather shoes against the stones was the only sound in the quiet neighborhood. I was heading toward the mailbox, a simple chore to create distance between myself and the arrogant invasion happening inside my home. My mind was a whirlwind of structural metaphors and demolition tactics. Victoria thought she had outsmarted a lonely, helpless old man. She thought she could just bulldoze her way into my life, erase Martha's memory, and relegate me to the damp shadows of the basement. She lacked the basic understanding that a foundation built on deceit always collapses under its own weight. I just needed to find the exact pressure point to bring her entire selfish world crashing down. I reached the end of the driveway and opened the heavy metal door of the mailbox. The hinges let out a soft creak. Inside, sitting on top of the usual pile of local newspapers and utility bills, was a thick stack of white envelopes. I pulled the stack out and began to sort through it as I slowly walked back up the driveway. The first few were standard advertisements and a water bill addressed to me. But the next 3 envelopes made my footsteps falter and completely stop. I stood in the middle of the driveway, the cold wind whipping around my shoulders, staring down at the names printed in bold black ink through the small plastic windows of the envelopes. They were not addressed to me. They were addressed to Gerald Higgins, Victoria's father. My eyes narrowed as I examined the return addresses. When someone moves temporarily for a 3-month condo remodel, they might forward their personal mail, maybe some magazines or a few packages. But they do not forward official government correspondence and urgent financial notices. The first envelope bore the unmistakable heavy block letters of the Internal Revenue Service. It was stamped with a red warning indicating a final notice before asset seizure. The second and third envelopes were from aggressive high-risk collection agencies based out of Chicago, the kind of firms that buy up massive amounts of defaulted debt when traditional banks have completely given up on collecting. The envelopes were thick, heavy with the weight of legal threats and absolute financial ruin. I did not need to open them to understand the story they told. The red ink, the urgent stamps, the sheer volume of paper inside those envelopes spoke a universal language. Gerald and Patricia Higgins were not remodeling a luxury condo in the city. You do not renovate a kitchen when the IRS is threatening to seize your assets. You do not hire contractors when collection agencies are hunting you down for defaulted loans. The truth hit me with the force of a physical blow, cold and absolute. They were completely, irrevocably bankrupt. They had lost everything, and they were drowning in a sea of massive unpayable debt. The 3-month temporary stay was a monumental lie, a carefully constructed illusion designed to get their foot in my door without triggering an immediate eviction. They had absolutely no intention of ever leaving my house. They had nowhere else to go. This was a permanent occupation. They planned to plant themselves in my cedar wood sanctuary, strip me of my territory, and live out the rest of their days leeching off the wealth and comfort I had spent a lifetime building. Victoria was not just an entitled daughter-in-law demanding an open-concept kitchen. She was the architect of a parasitic takeover attempting to secure a free luxury retirement for her bankrupt parents at the direct expense of my peace, my home, and my dignity. I stood there in the gravel, the wind biting through my tailored shirt, holding the undeniable proof of their deception. The lingering fatherly affection I might have still harbored for my son's wife died in that exact moment. It and turned to dust, blown away by the cold reality of her absolute greed. I folded the 3 letters carefully and slid them into the inner pocket of my jacket, right next to the business card I had taken from the interior designer. These letters were not just pieces of mail. They were leverage. They were the stress fractures in Victoria's grand facade, the exact weak points I would exploit to bring her entire structure down to the ground. I resumed my walk up the driveway, my steps purposeful and heavy. The house loomed ahead of me, beautiful and serene on the outside, but infected with deceit on the inside. I decided not to go back through the front door just yet. I needed a moment to catalog this new information, to adjust my internal blueprints. I veered off the gravel path and walked toward the detached garage on the side of the property. I figured I would fetch my pruning shears and some gardening tools, a perfect excuse to stay out of the house and observe them from a distance. The garage was my personal workspace filled with heavy steel tools, workbenches, and the smell of motor oil and sawdust. I approached the side door of the detached garage, my footsteps completely silenced by the thick, soft grass growing along the edge of the concrete foundation. I slowly reached out my right hand to turn the worn brass handle, but I abruptly stopped dead in my tracks before my fingers could even touch the cold metal surface. Through the thin painted wood of the side door, I suddenly heard a familiar voice. It was hushed, highly frantic, and completely filled with a desperate, furious, and volatile energy. It was my only son, Lucas. I was furiously pacing back and forth inside my garage, speaking rapidly into his cell phone. I leaned in close to the door, pressing my ear against the cold wood, holding my breath. I could hear every word with perfect, agonizing clarity. I was not talking to a client. He was not talking to a friend. He was on the phone with Victoria, and the conversation I was about to hear would shatter the final illusion I held about the boy I had raised, changing my life forever. I stood perfectly still on the soft grass, holding my breath, as I pressed my ear against the cold, painted wood of the side door. Inside the detached garage, the air was heavy with the familiar scents of motor oil, fresh sawdust, and old memories. But the frantic sound echoing off the concrete walls had nothing to do with the peaceful sanctuary I had built over 40 years of hard labor. It was the sound of my own son falling apart. Lucas was pacing back and forth, his expensive leather shoes scuffing against the cement floor. His breathing was ragged and shallow, catching in his throat like a man drowning. He was speaking into his cell phone, his voice a pathetic, wavering mixture of desperation and barely suppressed rage. I closed my eyes tightly, leaning closer to the thin barrier that separated us. I did not want to hear what was coming next, but a seasoned structural engineer always knows that you must inspect every single stress fracture, no matter how ugly the reality behind it might be. "Victoria, please, you have to listen to me," Lucas pleaded, his voice breaking. "We cannot keep doing this. I am completely tapped out, financially and emotionally." I heard a muffled, sharp response through the phone speaker, followed by a heavy sigh from my son. I could practically see him running a trembling hand through his expensive haircut. "You promised me this was going to be a temporary fix." He continued, his tone rising in panic. "You said your parents needed a bridge loan to get through the month while they figured things out. But the aggressive collectors keep calling my phone Victoria. The IRS sent another final warning notice to the house today. I intercepted it in the mailbox before Dad could see it, but I cannot keep running interference like this forever. He is old and he is quiet, but he is not stupid. If he finds out what we have been hiding, he will throw all of us out on the street without a second thought." The heavy realization washed over me, cold and unforgiving. Lucas was not covering up for his wife's parents. He was actively intercepting their mail on my property. He was playing the role of the loyal son, while acting as a shield for a pair of bankrupt parasites. But the worst truth was yet to come. I listened as the muffled voice on the other end of the line grew louder, sharper, and demanding more from him. Victoria was relentlessly pressing him, pushing him into a corner. Then Lucas finally snapped under the pressure. He let out a choked, wet sob that sounded like it was being ripped from his chest. "I drained our entire savings to pay off your parents' debt. Victoria," he cried out, his voice echoing inside the cold and empty garage. "Every single penny we had set aside for the future is completely gone. I emptied my retirement fund. I liquidated the college accounts. I gave them absolutely everything just to keep the collection agencies from filing criminal charges against your father. I have absolutely nothing left to give you." The silence that followed his outburst was deafening. I stood outside the door, my heart turning to lead. My son, the boy I had raised to be honest, strong, and highly responsible, had bankrupted his own family. He had stolen from his own future, from the future of any children he might one day have, just to appease his demanding wife and her reckless, financially ruined parents. He was completely broke, hollowed out from the inside by his own pathetic weakness. But the devastation of this moment did not stop there. The entire conversation shifted, and the tone of Victoria's voice coming through the tiny speaker changed from angry to cold and calculating. I could not hear her exact words, but I heard Lucas respond to her, and what he said next made the blood freeze in my veins. "What else do you want me to make the old man sign today?" Lucas demanded, his voice thick with tears, frustration, and shame. I already got him to agree to let them move in under the clever guise of a temporary stay. I cannot push him any harder right now. If I hand him another thick stack of legal papers and ask him to sign away his medical proxy or his property rights, he is going to know something is terribly wrong. We have to wait this out with me right now. We have to get them fully settled into the house first, establish their legal residency, and then we can talk about taking over his finances. You have to be patient, Victoria. I promise you, we will get the house and the money, but you absolutely cannot rush this process. I stepped back from the wooden door, the crisp Minnesota wind suddenly feeling like ice against my skin. The sickening reality of the situation crashed down on me with the crushing weight of a massive, collapsing skyscraper. My son was not just a weak man caught in a toxic marriage. He was not just a victim of his wife's manipulation. He was an active, willing participant in a calculated plot to bleed his own father dry. He was actively conspiring to strip me of my hard-earned independence, my remaining assets, and my peaceful home. He was meticulously planning to make me sign away my basic legal rights so he could steal my life savings to patch the massive financial hole he had foolishly dug for himself. The comforting illusion of the stressed, overwhelmed, well-meaning son vanished completely, instantly replaced by the horrifying image of a traitor standing right inside my own garage. I looked down at my hands. They were steady. The trembling sorrow that a father should feel was completely absent, burned away by a sudden, intense clarity. When you spend decades building massive structures from the ground up you learn a hard, unyielding truth. Sometimes a building is so structurally compromised, so deeply infected with rot and corruption, that it cannot be saved. You cannot patch a concrete foundation that is actively working to destroy itself. You have to wire it with industrial explosives, completely clear the entire perimeter, and then safely bring the whole thing down to the ground. Inside the garage, I heard Lucas end the phone call. I heard him take a deep, shaky breath, desperately trying to compose himself in the dark, trying to put the mask of the loving son back on his face before he had to face me again. He had no idea that the mask was already useless. He had no idea that the quiet man he was planning to betray had just designed the blueprint for his absolute ruin. I turned away from the garage door, my footsteps silent on the soft grass, and walked back toward the cedar wood sanctuary that they foolishly thought they were going to easily steal from me. The game was no longer about simply defending my remaining territory against those arrogant invaders. It was about absolute, total, and completely unforgiving permanent destruction. I walked away from the detached garage with the horrifying echo of my son's voice still ringing in my ears. The betrayal was a heavy, suffocating weight pressing down on my chest, but my mind was remarkably clear. I did not storm into the house in a fit of rage. I did not confront Lucas or demand answers. A confrontation would only give them the opportunity to lie, to backpedal, to spin a new web of deceit. Instead, I walked around the perimeter of the cedar wood sanctuary I had built, letting the cold Minnesota wind cool the lingering heat of anger in my blood. I needed to maintain the illusion that I was still the oblivious, harmless old man they thought I was. I made my way to the front, pulling my jacket a little tighter against the afternoon breeze, and sat down in the large Adirondack chair that overlooked the shimmering waters of Lake Minnetonka. I leaned my head back against the wooden slats, closed my eyes, and crossed my hands over my stomach, adopting the perfect posture of a tired grandfather, taking a peaceful afternoon nap in the sun. I had only been sitting there in feigned sleep for about 15 minutes when I heard the heavy glass sliding door of the adjacent patio slide open along its metal track. The patio was positioned just around the corner from the front porch, separated by a thin cedar lattice covered in climbing ivy. It offered a perfect acoustic channel. I kept my eyes completely shut, my breathing slow and rhythmic, as the sharp, unmistakable clicking of Victoria's high heels sounded against the wooden deckboards. She sighed heavily, a sound full of exasperation and entitlement, and then the electronic chime of a cell phone dialing broke the tranquil silence of the lakefront. She had placed the call on speakerphone. A few seconds later, the shrill, demanding voice of Patricia Higgins, Victoria's mother, blasted through the digital speaker. Patricia whined, her voice dripping with absolute irritation. "Tell me you have good news. Your father and I are losing our minds packing up this miserable apartment. Please tell me we do not have to put up with that quiet old man for very long. I cannot stand the idea of tiptoeing around him and sharing a kitchen with someone who constantly smells like old coffee and hardware stores." I kept my breathing perfectly steady, not allowing a single muscle in my face to twitch, even as my heart turned to a block of solid ice inside my chest. "Mom, you just need to calm down and follow the plan." Victoria replied, her tone as cold and sharp as shattered glass. "I told you this is a careful process. You and Dad just need to get your things moved in on Saturday. That is the very first step." "But how long?" Patricia demanded, sounding highly offended. "How long do we have to pretend to be gracious guests? I want to knock down those ugly load-bearing walls. I want my luxury spa bathroom. I do not want to live in his shadow." "You only have to endure him for 30 days, Victoria explained, her voice completely devoid of any human empathy. "Listen to me very carefully, Mom. You establish residency for 30 days. You transfer your mail immediately. The IRS notices the collection letters forward absolutely everything to this exact address. Under Minnesota squatter and tenancy laws, once you live there for 30 days and receive official mail at the property, he legally becomes your landlord. He will not be able to just throw you out. Eviction takes months, sometimes years, and he simply does not have the stamina for a lengthy legal battle." Patricia let out a cruel, highly satisfied laugh on the other end of the line. "And what about the house? We need the actual deed, Victoria. The aggressive creditors are breathing right down your father's neck." "I have that completely under control," Victoria said with absolute arrogance. "Lucas is already breaking under the pressure. I have him exactly where I need him. Once you and Dad are firmly established as legal residents, we are going to start laying the groundwork for the next phase. We will carefully observe the old man. We will document every single time he misplaces his keys, every time he forgets a simple name, every time he takes a long nap. Then we will file a formal petition for a medical evaluation with the state. We will loudly claim severe cognitive decline. We will falsely say he is a terrible danger to himself and absolutely cannot manage his own affairs or his massive estate." My eyes remained tightly closed, but the darkness behind my eyelids was violently spinning with the sheer magnitude of their calculated evil. They were not just stealing my beautiful home. They were actively plotting to steal my mind, my hard-earned autonomy, my dignity, and my total freedom. "Once the court declares him highly incompetent," Victoria continued smoothly, "Lucas will automatically be appointed as his legal guardian. We will immediately put the old man in a state-run nursing home. It does not even have to be a nice one, just somewhere highly secure where he cannot cause any trouble or talk to any expensive lawyers. With Lucas as the full financial proxy, we will quickly transfer the deed of the lake house entirely into our own names. We will instantly liquidate his remaining retirement accounts to pay off your massive debts, Mom. The house will be entirely ours, and Richard will just quietly fade away in a secure facility. It is a completely foolproof strategy. You just have to be highly patient and correctly play the quiet part for a few more short weeks." "Oh, Victoria, you are absolutely brilliant," Patricia cooed, sounding exactly as if her cruel daughter had just cured a terrible disease instead of plotting the total destruction of an innocent, elderly man. I will definitely start packing the good china. We will see you very early on Saturday morning. The call disconnected with a sharp electronic beep. I heard Victoria sigh contentedly, her expensive heels clicking rhythmically against the wood as she confidently walked back inside the house, quickly sliding the heavy glass door completely shut directly behind her. The peaceful silence of the lake returned, but the beautiful sanctuary I had loved so deeply was forever tainted. I slowly opened my eyes. The bright afternoon sun was still happily shining over the pristine blue waters of Lake Minnetonka, but I felt absolutely no warmth whatsoever. The betrayal was absolute, comprehensive, and completely staggering in its profound cruelty. They did not just want my spacious property. They did not just want my hard-earned savings. They actively wanted to completely erase my very existence from this earth. The gentle, grandfatherly warmth that lived deep inside me, the highly forgiving patience that defined my quiet retirement, instantly died on that porch. It withered away and rapidly turned to dust, instantly replaced by cold, hard, unforgiving structural steel. As an engineer, I suddenly knew exactly how to execute their perfect demolition. I stood up from the Adirondack chair on the front porch, leaving the bright afternoon sun and the shimmering waters of Lake Minnetonka behind me. The cold, hard steel that had just replaced my grandfatherly warmth made my movements precise and highly deliberate. I walked back into the house through the heavy oak front door, my footsteps silent against the polished hardwood floors. I could hear Victoria in the kitchen humming a cheerful tune as she opened and closed the custom cabinets, already treating my cedar wood sanctuary as if it belonged entirely to her. I did not stop to look at her. I did not offer a polite smile or a casual greeting. I walked straight past the kitchen down the long hallway and stepped into my private study. It was a room Victoria and Lucas rarely entered, a quiet space filled with structural engineering textbooks, rolled blueprints, and the lingering scent of old paper and worn leather. I closed the solid mahogany door behind me and turned the brass lock. The heavy metallic click of the deadbolt sliding into place was the sound of a secure vault sealing completely shut. I walked over to my desk, sat down in my leather chair, and picked up the phone. I dialed a number I had known by heart for over 20 years. It was the direct line for Thomas Thorne, my longtime attorney, and one of the most ruthless corporate lawyers in the state of Minnesota. Thomas was not a family law attorney who dealt in mediation and hurt feelings. He was a corporate litigator, a man who specialized in hostile takeovers, asset protection, and dismantling fraudulent enterprises with absolute surgical precision. He answered on the second ring, his voice crisp and professional. I did not waste any time with pleasantries. I told him exactly what was happening in my home. I explained the sudden invasion, the interior designer sketching out the destruction of Martha's garden, and the final notices from the Internal Revenue Service and aggressive collection agencies that I had discovered in the mailbox. I recounted the desperate, frantic conversation I had overheard my son having in the detached garage and the cold, calculated master plan Victoria had outlined to her mother on the patio. I laid out the entire structure of their deception, presenting the facts with the detached analytical clarity of a structural engineer presenting a critical building inspection report. Thomas listened in absolute silence, only interrupting to ask for the exact correct spelling of Gerald and Patricia Higgins and the name of the bank where Lucas held his primary accounts. When I finished my detailed account, the silence on the other end of the line was heavy and charged with dangerous purpose. Richard Thomas finally said, his voice dropping an octave, sounding completely lethal. I am going to put my entire investigative team on this immediately. We are going to perform a complete financial autopsy on these people. I want to know exactly how deep this rot goes before we make a single move. I will call you back the moment I have the full picture. Do not let them know you suspect a thing. I thanked him, hung up the receiver, and leaned back in my chair. The next few hours were the longest of my life. I sat in the quiet solitude of my locked study, watching the afternoon sun slowly sink below the tree line outside my window, casting long, dark shadows across the room. I looked at a silver-framed photograph of my late wife, Martha, sitting on my desk. I thought about the life we had built together, the immense sacrifices we had made to provide a solid foundation for our only son. We had given Lucas everything, hoping to shape him into a man of honor and absolute integrity. Instead, he had become a weak, desperate participant in a parasitic takeover, fully willing to sacrifice his own father to appease his demanding wife. The sorrow I should have felt was completely gone, burned away by a cold, unforgiving clarity. When you discover that a load-bearing pillar is compromised by deep structural rot, you do not try to paint over the cracks. You prepare for a total demolition. Finally, as evening settled over the lake, the phone rang. I picked it up immediately. Thomas was on the line, and his voice was tight with disbelief and heavily controlled anger. "Richard," he began, "I have the preliminary results from my investigators, and the situation is significantly worse than you suspected. This is not just a simple case of bad debt. This is absolute, comprehensive financial ruin." Thomas paused, clearly organizing the massive amount of highly destructive data his team had uncovered in a matter of hours. Gerald and Patricia Higgins are completely drowning in a massive sea of liabilities. They owe a staggering $800,000 in combined debt. The Internal Revenue Service is already moving to seize their remaining assets for years of unpaid taxes. They have defaulted on 3 separate personal loans, and multiple aggressive collection agencies out of Chicago are actively hunting them down. They have absolutely zero credit, zero savings, and zero prospects. They are completely bankrupt in every possible sense of the word. They are not moving into your beautiful lake house temporarily to wait for a condo remodel. They are actively fleeing a complete financial apocalypse, and they fully intend to use your property as their permanent bunker. I absorbed this shocking information without flinching. It simply confirmed the grim calculations I had already made in my head. But what Thomas said next struck a deep nerve that I did not even know was still exposed. "And then there is Lucas," Thomas continued, his sharp tone softening just a fraction, acknowledging the profound pain a loving father must feel hearing this terrible truth about his own child. "Your son has completely destroyed his own life trying to bail them out. He did not just drain his personal savings and his retirement funds. Our audit shows that 3 months ago, Lucas secretly took out a massive second mortgage on his own home. He borrowed heavily against the equity he and Victoria had slowly built. But it gets much worse, Richard. In order to qualify for that massive second loan given his current debt-to-income ratio, Lucas submitted falsified income documents to the bank. He committed federal mortgage fraud. If the bank discovers the altered documents, or if he misses a single payment, they will not just foreclose on his house. They will refer him for criminal prosecution. Lucas is financially ruined. He is completely trapped. The illusion of my happy family had been entirely stripped away, leaving only the bare, ugly framing of their greed. They wanted to steal my sanctuary, erase my existence, and discard me into a nursing home while they lived in luxury on my dime. But they had made a fatal miscalculation. They had fundamentally underestimated the man they were trying to betray. I was finally ready to execute my perfect, uncompromising, and devastating structural demolition, tearing down their selfish lies and salting the earth so they could never rebuild. The heavy silence that followed the devastating financial autopsy hung in the air of my private study like a thick fog. I sat perfectly still in my leather chair, looking at the framed photograph of Martha on my desk. The woman I had loved with all my heart had spent her entire life trying to protect our son. Now that very same son had mortgaged his own future and committed massive federal fraud just to appease a family of ruthless parasites. Thomas remained on the line, giving me the necessary time to process the absolute magnitude of this terrible betrayal. I was a dedicated professional, completely accustomed to dealing with the messy fallout of massive corporate disasters. But even he sounded slightly shaken by the sheer audacity of Victoria and her bankrupt parents. When you discover that the foundation of your life is built on a massive lie, your first instinct is usually sudden panic. You want to scream, to confront the traitors, to demand a loud explanation for their profound cruelty. But as a structural engineer, I do not operate on panic. I operate on cold, calculated logic. My grandfatherly warmth was gone, replaced by a cold, unyielding resolve. Richard Thomas finally said, breaking the long silence. His voice was calm, highly measured, and completely serious. We have enough hard evidence of their fraudulent intentions to act immediately. Given the severity of the situation, and the fact that your son is actively intercepting your personal mail, I strongly advise that we file an emergency restraining order against Gerald and Patricia Higgins right now. We can have a judge sign it by tomorrow morning. That legal document will permanently prevent them from stepping foot on your private property. We can also draft a formal cease and desist letter right now. That letter will warn Victoria that any further attempts to manipulate your medical proxy will result in immediate criminal charges. It is the safest, most standard legal route to protect your massive assets and your physical welfare. I closed my eyes and took a slow, very deep breath. I pictured the restraining order in my mind, a thin piece of white paper bearing the signature of a judge at the bottom. To a normal law-abiding citizen, a restraining order is a serious deterrent. But I was not dealing with normal citizens. I was dealing with desperate, totally bankrupt invaders. They had absolutely nothing left to lose. Gerald and Patricia were already fleeing from the Internal Revenue Service and highly aggressive collection agencies. A simple piece of paper from a local judge was not going to stop them from trying to steal my beautiful home. They would ignore it completely, violate it, and force me into a prolonged, exhausting legal battle that could drag on for many years. Victoria would spin the false narrative loudly, claiming I was a confused, highly paranoid old man, making terrible accusations against her loving parents. They would deliberately use the complicated public legal system. They would drain my remaining energy and my finances. "No, Thomas," I replied, my voice perfectly steady and completely devoid of any human emotion. "We are not filing a simple restraining order. I do not want to send them a weak warning. I do not want to give them the easy opportunity to hire cheap lawyers and fight me in a public court. A restraining order is just a piece of paper, and pieces of paper do not stop a collapsing building from safely falling. They only delay the inevitable total destruction." Thomas paused silently on the secure phone line. I could hear the slight confusion in his professional voice when he finally responded to me. "Then what exactly do you want to do, Richard? If we do not block them legally right now, they are going to show up at your front door on Saturday morning with 2 massive commercial moving trucks, fully intending to establish permanent residency under state tenancy laws. Once they cross that threshold and bring their heavy belongings inside, legally removing them will be an absolute nightmare." "I know exactly what they are planning to do," I said, leaning forward in my leather desk chair. "And I want them to bring those massive trucks. I want them to arrive at my beautiful property believing they have completely won the war. I do not want to simply keep them away from my quiet house, Thomas. I want absolute, comprehensive devastation. I want to trap them in a dark corner so tightly that they will never be able to recover. I want to completely dismantle their massive arrogance piece by piece until they have absolutely nothing left in this world." There was a moment of profound, heavy silence on the secure line between the two of us. When Thomas finally spoke again, his tone had completely shifted. The highly cautious family attorney was entirely gone, replaced by the ruthless corporate litigator I had known for decades. "I am carefully listening, Richard. Tell me exactly what you need me to do today." I outlined my master blueprint with the absolute precision of a smart man designing a high-security vault. I instructed Thomas to immediately file the necessary legal paperwork to create a brand new, completely anonymous corporate limited liability company. I did not want my name publicly associated with this new, faceless, corporate legal entity right now. I wanted it shielded by dense layers of strict corporate privacy laws. Thomas was an absolute expert at this. He knew exactly how to securely establish the company, using registered agents to ensure my complete anonymity. Once the corporate entity is legally established, I continued my voice very cold and highly focused. I want you to draft a formal contract of total sale. I am going to legally and quietly sell my $1.2 million lake house directly to this new corporation. We will execute the entire financial transaction immediately without any delays or stupid costly mistakes today. I want the original deed transferred, the official titles updated, and the local property records completely scrubbed of my personal name by Friday afternoon right before they proudly arrive. Thomas let out a low, quiet whistle of deep appreciation. That is a truly brilliant maneuver, Richard. By transferring the property to a corporate entity, you completely remove yourself from the entire equation as a vulnerable private homeowner. But I need to make sure you fully understand the gravity of this monumental decision. Once you sign those final official closing documents, you will no longer own the house at all today. The beautiful sanctuary you lovingly built for your peaceful retirement belonged to a faceless corporation. You will simply be a quiet majority shareholder in that new company. Are you absolutely certain you want to sever your deep personal attachment to the property? This specific way, I am completely certain. Thomas, I answered without a single trace of emotional hesitation. A house is just wood, glass, and concrete. The moment they decided to steal it from me, it completely stopped being a warm family home. I am ready to be just a shareholder in a faceless corporation starting today. Thomas did not waste a single second after our phone call ended. He was a man who understood the value of momentum, and he immediately set his vast legal machinery into motion. By Tuesday morning, less than 24 hours after I gave him the green light, the anonymous limited liability company was officially registered with the state. We named it Apex Holdings. It was a cold, generic name designed to completely disappear among thousands of other corporate entities in the public records. Through a series of rapid, legally bulletproof transactions, I sold my beautiful cedar wood sanctuary directly to Apex Holdings. The transfer of the property deed was expedited and fully executed by a private notary, whom Thomas trusted implicitly. I sat in his sleek downtown office, a pen in my hand, and carefully signed my name on the dotted line of the closing documents. With that single stroke of black ink, I legally severed my personal connection to the house I had purchased to honor Martha. I was no longer Richard, the homeowner, the vulnerable widower, the easy target. I was merely a silent, invisible shareholder in a highly protected corporate fortress. The money from the sale was instantly moved into a secure trust, completely shielding my life savings from any future fraudulent claims Lucas or Victoria might try to file. The house now belonged to a faceless entity that could not be emotionally manipulated, blackmailed, or thrown into a nursing home. But transferring the ownership was only the laying of the new foundation. The true genius of the blueprint, the exact maneuver that would absolutely crush Victoria and her bankrupt parents, was the second phase of Thomas's aggressive legal strategy. Once the deed was securely recorded under the name of the new corporation, Thomas immediately filed an expedited application with the county planning department to change the legal zoning classification of the property. For decades, my quiet lake house had been zoned strictly as a single-family residential dwelling. That specific classification was exactly what Victoria was counting on. She had done her homework on standard residential tenancy laws. She knew that if her parents managed to get their belongings inside a residential home and establish a physical presence for 30 days, the local police would be completely powerless to remove them without a formal court order. They would be legally classified as tenants, and I would be forced into a grueling, incredibly expensive civil eviction process that could easily drag on for an entire year. During that entire year, they would live rent-free in my sanctuary, slowly draining my resources and building their fraudulent medical case against me. But Victoria had fundamentally misunderstood the structural mechanics of property law. She assumed the legal framework of the house was fixed and unyielding. As an engineer, I knew that if a structure's existing framework leaves you vulnerable to a specific type of attack, you simply alter the framework. You change the fundamental rules of the physical space. Thomas used his considerable influence and corporate connections to push the zoning application through the county office at record speed. By Wednesday afternoon, the legal status of the property was completely transformed. My home was no longer classified as a single-family residential dwelling. It was now officially and legally zoned as a corporate short-term rental facility. This change in classification completely stripped the property of all standard residential tenancy protections. The specific squatter laws that Victoria had so arrogantly explained to her mother on my back patio simply did not apply to commercial lodging facilities. It was the exact equivalent of replacing a weak wooden door with a solid steel vault. Thomas called me on a secure line to confirm the approval, his voice ringing with a sharp, predatory satisfaction. The zoning change has been officially approved and recorded in the county database, he announced. You are completely immunized against their entire strategy. If Gerald and Patricia Higgins attempt to establish residency, now they will not be dealing with civil tenancy laws. A commercial property operates under an entirely different legal jurisdiction. Anyone who enters a corporate short-term rental facility without a valid signed commercial lease and refuses to leave is not considered a difficult tenant. They are legally classified as hostile intruders committing a crime. If they refuse to vacate the premises, the local police will not tell you that it is a civil matter. The authorities will immediately arrest them for criminal trespassing on a private corporate property. The absolute brilliance of this legal web washed over me, bringing a profound sense of cold comfort. Victoria had built her entire parasitic master plan on the assumption that she could manipulate the residential legal system to trap me. She thought she was leading me into a corner where the law would tie my hands and force me to endure her parents occupying my personal space. Instead, without her knowing a single thing about it, the very ground beneath her feet had been completely replaced. She was planning to confidently walk into a standard residential home on Saturday morning, completely unaware that she was actually marching her bankrupt parents directly into a heavily fortified commercial trap. I spent the entire Thursday morning walking slowly through the quiet, sunlit rooms of the lake house, observing the space through this entirely new legal perspective. The beautiful custom oak bookshelves, the wide bay windows overlooking the pristine waters of Lake Minnetonka, the smooth hardwood floors, they all looked exactly the same. The physical facade of the building had not changed a single bit, but the invisible structural mechanics holding it together had been fundamentally weaponized. The house was now fully armed and quietly waiting patiently for the arrogant invaders to arrive. I felt an immense, overwhelming sense of liberation. The heavy burden of fear, the suffocating anxiety that had gripped my chest when I first heard my son plotting my ruin in the dark garage had completely evaporated. I was no longer a victim waiting to be slaughtered by his own family. I was the architect of their inevitable downfall. Thomas had executed the legal restructuring flawlessly, ensuring that the corporate veil was impenetrable. There were no loose ends, no lingering vulnerabilities, and absolutely no way for Victoria to trace the new corporate ownership back to me before the trap was fully sprung. Every single legal document, every filed application, and every financial transfer was sealed tight. The transition was so seamless and so quiet that my son and his greedy wife continued their arrogant preparations completely undisturbed. They were still packing their boxes, still dreaming of tearing down my load, bearing walls, and still rehearsing the cruel lies they planned to tell the medical evaluators to lock me away in a facility. They believed they were brilliant strategists executing a flawless takeover. They had absolutely no idea that the sanctuary they were so eager to steal had already been legally erased from existence, replaced by a ruthless corporate machine designed to utterly and completely destroy them. I was more than ready for Saturday morning. I was ready to watch them blindly fall into the deep abyss they had foolishly created. With the legal foundation of Apex Holdings completely solidified and the commercial zoning successfully recorded in the county database, I moved to the next critical phase of my blueprint. A corporate short-term rental facility is absolutely useless without paying tenants to legally occupy the space. But I did not want just any ordinary guests. I was not looking for a quiet family on a peaceful summer vacation or an elderly couple wanting to simply birdwatch by the lake. I needed a specific type of highly disruptive energy. I needed a relentless force of nature that would completely shatter the arrogant illusion Victoria and her bankrupt parents had built. I instructed Thomas to immediately use his extensive network in the downtown business district to find the perfect commercial clients for our new enterprise. I told him to look specifically for corporate groups targeting young, highly energetic tech companies that were frantically seeking an off-site location for a massive team-building retreat. Within 24 hours, Thomas delivered exactly what I requested. A rapidly growing software startup based out of Chicago was actively searching for a premium private waterfront property to celebrate their recent successful public offering. They were a group of 20 young men in their mid-20s, flushed with new corporate money and looking for a place where they could be as loud, rowdy, and boisterous as they pleased for an entire month without any consequences. I drove into the city the very next morning to meet their young chief executive officer in person at a high-end coffee shop. He was 26 years old, wearing expensive designer sneakers and a casual hoodie that probably cost more than my very first car. He enthusiastically explained that his entire software development team had been working grueling 80-hour weeks for 2 straight years, and they were desperately looking for a massive, unrestrained party retreat. They wanted to drink expensive beer on the wooden deck, play loud music late into the night, barbecue massive steaks on the grill, and celebrate their hard-earned wealth without worrying about bothering any sensitive residential neighbors. I smiled perfectly, channeling the polished demeanor of a seasoned corporate property manager, and assured him that Apex Holdings could provide the absolute perfect venue for their aggressive corporate celebration. I presented him with a heavily detailed, ironclad commercial lease agreement that Thomas had drafted. The contract clearly specified that they would have exclusive, uninterrupted commercial access to the entire $1.2 million property for exactly 1 month. I gave them an incredibly generous corporate discount on the standard monthly rate, under the strict non-negotiable condition that they adhere to a very specific and rigid move-in schedule. The young executive eagerly signed the commercial lease without a single second thought, his signature legally binding the property to their rowdy corporate occupation. The trap was now fully baited and securely armed. However, a group of 20 partying tech developers is not quite enough to execute a flawless, highly secure demolition. I needed professional muscle to physically enforce the strict commercial laws I had just weaponized against my own family. A commercial rental facility requires active on-site management, especially when the legal property owner fully anticipates a hostile, unauthorized residential invasion. I reached out to a premier private security and logistics firm located right in the heart of Minneapolis. This was not a standard friendly neighborhood watch service. They were highly trained corporate enforcers staffed primarily by former military personnel and retired law enforcement officers who specialized in high-risk asset protection and immediate threat neutralization. I hired a comprehensive property management team to act as the official, unyielding representatives of Apex Holdings on the ground. I personally met with the head of the security detail, a physically imposing, highly serious man named Marcus, who operated with the cold, absolute precision of a military tactician. I laid out the exact parameters of the security contract for him. I provided him with highly detailed blueprints of the property, the exact property lines and the specific county zoning codes that officially designated the house as a commercial facility. I explained that an unauthorized group of desperate individuals might attempt to aggressively access the property, falsely claiming standard residential tenancy. I instructed Marcus and his highly trained team that under no circumstances were they to allow anyone without a valid commercial lease to cross the threshold of the property. I legally authorized them to use whatever standard legal force was completely necessary to protect the corporate asset up to and including immediate physical detainment for criminal trespassing. Marcus reviewed the legal documents, nodded slowly, and assured me that his men would completely lock down the entire perimeter. He promised that the property would operate as an impenetrable commercial fortress. The final most crucial element of the entire operation was the exact timing. I synchronized the schedules with absolute, unforgiving perfection. The tech startup's commercial lease was set to officially commence on Saturday morning at precisely 8 o'clock. The property management team and the private security firm were contracted to arrive on site at exactly 7:30 in the morning to establish their command post and fully prepare for the incoming corporate guests. This was the exact same Saturday morning, down to the very hour that Victoria had confidently instructed her bankrupt parents to arrive with their 2 massive commercial moving trucks. I had meticulously engineered a devastating high-speed collision between their pathetic, fraudulent residential invasion and a highly funded, legally protected corporate reality. They were blindly marching toward my property, fully expecting to find a quiet, defeated old man waiting to surrender his home. Instead, they were going to find a fortified commercial facility, heavily guarded by professional enforcers and completely occupied by 20 loud, energetic strangers who legally owned the space. I spent the rest of the evening reviewing the finalized contracts, feeling a profound sense of cold satisfaction. Every single variable had been calculated. Every potential loophole had been permanently sealed shut. The foundation of their parasitic takeover was about to be completely obliterated by the unforgiving weight of absolute legal and physical force. I simply had to wait for them to arrogantly walk directly into the jaws of the trap. The financial devastation they had secretly planned for my peaceful twilight years would quickly become their own permanent reality. Victoria truly believed that by manipulating my son, by silently intercepting those terrifying collection letters, and by actively plotting to steal my medical proxy, she possessed total control over the entire situation. She constantly confused my quiet patience for pathetic weakness. But as a lifelong structural engineer, I knew that the most catastrophic building failures do not happen slowly. They happen in one violent, unyielding instant, when the hidden stress finally exceeds the maximum load-bearing capacity. I sat back in my leather recliner, slowly sipping my black coffee, feeling the heavy anticipation settling deep into my bones. The detailed blueprints for their utter ruin were fully drafted, legally approved, and flawlessly set into motion. There was absolutely no escaping the massive collapse that was now rapidly approaching them. The countdown had started. The countdown had started. I had exactly 3 days before Saturday morning to strip away every lingering trace of my personal history from the property. A corporate short-term rental facility could not look like a grieving widower's sanctuary. It needed to be a sterile shell, completely devoid of the warmth and memories that Victoria and her bankrupt parents were eager to exploit. I woke up early on Wednesday morning, brewed my final pot of dark roast coffee, and began the meticulous process of packing up my life. I did not hire professional movers. I wanted to handle everything with my own 2 hands, treating the removal of my belongings with the exact precision I would use to dismantle a delicate architectural model. I started in the living room, carefully rolling up the heavy antique rugs that Martha and I had spent months searching for at estate sales. The sound of the thick wool fibers rolling together was strangely comforting. It was the sound of a tactical retreat, the quiet gathering of my resources before the final confrontation. I moved through the house methodically, completely erasing my existence from the space. I took down the oak bookshelves I had built, unscrewing the wooden planks and wrapping them in protective blankets. I packed away my structural engineering textbooks, the rolled blueprints of skyscrapers I had designed, and the heavy steel tools from my detached garage. The garage had been my private workshop, a sanctuary filled with the comforting scents of motor oil and fresh sawdust. Now it was an empty concrete box, echoing with the cold reality of what my son had planned there in the dark. But the most difficult part of the entire process was packing Martha's memories. I walked into the master bedroom and stood before the large mahogany dresser where her silver-framed photographs had sat undisturbed for 5 years. There was a picture of her smiling on our honeymoon, a candid shot of her tending to her memorial garden, and a photograph of us holding Lucas when he was a baby, looking at that sweet baby. It was impossible to reconcile the innocent child with the deceitful man who was conspiring to lock me away. I carefully wrapped each silver frame in soft tissue paper and placed them into a secure moving box. I packed away her favorite porcelain tea set, the delicate lace curtains she had hand-sewn, and the small collection of vintage novels she used to read by the fireplace. With every item I placed into a box, I felt a distinct emotional shift inside my chest. The profound sorrow that had anchored me to this property was slowly lifting, instantly replaced by a cold, impenetrable armor. I was not abandoning my home. I was actively rescuing the soul of my family from a toxic, parasitic infection. Over the course of those 3 days, I rented a commercial cargo van and made multiple quiet trips across the county. My destination was a small, private, secondary cabin that I had purchased several years ago on the far north side of Lake Minnetonka. It was a rustic property hidden deep within a grove of pine trees, completely invisible from the main highway. I had originally bought it as a quiet fishing retreat. Now it was going to be my permanent fortress. The small cabin was peaceful, highly secure, and entirely disconnected from the toxic web Victoria had arrogantly spun. I unloaded my boxes carefully, unrolled the antique rugs on the worn hardwood floors, and placed Martha's silver-framed photographs on the stone mantelpiece above the small fireplace. The exact moment I set those pictures down, the tiny cabin instantly felt like a true home. It was safe. It was entirely mine. Most importantly, my son and his greedy wife had absolutely no idea that this secondary property even existed. They had never asked about my financial portfolio, assuming that the large lake house was my only valuable asset. Their absolute lack of genuine curiosity had provided me with the perfect undetectable escape route. By Friday evening, the physical labor was finished. I drove the empty cargo van back to the city, returned the keys to the rental agency, and took a quiet taxi back to the cedar wood house for one final night. When I unlocked the heavy oak front door and stepped inside the hallway, the total transformation was staggering. The sanctuary was completely gone. In its place stood a bare, echoing commercial shell. The hardwood floors were stripped of their rugs. The walls were bare, exposing the faint outlines where picture frames had protected the paint for years. The custom oak bookshelves were missing, leaving the living room looking unnaturally spacious and hollow. I walked through the empty rooms, listening to the sharp echo of my leather shoes clicking against the polished wood. The house felt incredibly cold, completely devoid of the grandfatherly warmth that had once filled every corner. It was exactly what Apex Holdings required. It was a blank corporate canvas waiting patiently for the rowdy tech startup group to arrive and claim their rented territory. I did not sleep in the master bedroom that night. There was no comfortable bed left. Instead, I sat in a metal folding chair I had left behind in the center of the empty living room. I spent the night fully awake, watching the bright moonlight shift across the bare wooden floorboards, listening to the gentle lapping of the lake water against the dock outside. I felt an incredible sense of calm wash over my body. The anxiety of the betrayal and the fear of their fraudulent medical evaluation plot had been excised from my mind. I was a structural engineer, and I was about to execute the most flawless demolition of my career. Saturday morning arrived. The sky over Lake Minnetonka was a brilliant blue painting, the calm waters in strokes of gold and silver. I stood up, walked into the empty master bathroom, and washed my face with cold water. I had brought one final outfit with me chosen for this exact moment. I did not put on the comfortable clothes of a retired country grandfather. I dressed myself in a tailored charcoal gray Italian suit. I fastened a crisp white dress shirt, tied a silk tie, and polished my leather dress shoes until they gleamed in the sunlight. I looked into the bathroom mirror and saw the man I was. I was not a confused old man waiting to be discarded into a sterile nursing home. I was the silent majority shareholder of a ruthless corporate entity, and I was ready to defend my territory with unforgiving authority. I walked back into the center of the bare living room, folded my hands behind my back, and planted my feet firmly on the hardwood floor. The house was silent, a perfect vacuum waiting to be violently shattered. I stood there, still breathing slowly and rhythmically, looking straight ahead at the heavy oak front door. The trap was set, the legal web was impenetrable, and the corporate muscle was positioned down the street. I was ready. I was waiting for the invaders to arrive. The morning sun continued its slow, steady climb over Lake Minnetonka, casting a brilliant golden light across the empty hardwood floors of my former sanctuary. It was precisely 7:45 in the morning. The neighborhood was enveloped in that profound, serene quiet that only a crisp Saturday morning can provide. The only sounds were the gentle lapping of the lake water against the wooden dock and the occasional call of a distant bird. I stood perfectly still in the center of the bare living room, my hands clasped loosely behind my back, feeling the crisp fabric of my charcoal gray Italian suit against my skin. I was a man entirely at peace. The suffocating anxiety of the past week had been completely replaced by the cold, calculated precision of an engineer watching a demolition countdown reach its final seconds. Exactly at 7:55. The tranquil silence of the lakefront was violently shattered. A deep mechanical rumbling echoed from the main road, growing steadily louder as it approached my property line. The sound was heavy, aggressive, and entirely out of place in this quiet residential enclave. I did not move from my spot, but my eyes remained locked on the heavy oak front door. Through the large front windows, I watched as the source of the mechanical growl finally appeared. Two massive 26-foot commercial U-Haul trucks turned sharply off the main road and began to slowly rumble up my long gravel driveway. The heavy tires crunched loudly against the stones, kicking up thick clouds of white dust that hung in the morning air like smoke from a battlefield. They were not arriving quietly. They were announcing their invasion to the entire neighborhood. The sheer size of the commercial vehicles was a staggering visual confirmation of their absolute greed. They had brought everything they owned, fully intending to completely occupy my space, drain my resources, and erase my existence. The two massive trucks groaned and hissed loudly as they engaged their air brakes, coming to a heavy shuddering stop right in front of the main porch. The large diesel engines idled loudly, vibrating the glass panes of my front windows. For a brief moment, no one emerged. They were likely sitting in the cabs, looking up at the beautiful cedar wood exterior of the house, admiring the prize they believed they had successfully stolen from a weak, clueless old man. Then the doors of the lead truck swung open. Victoria stepped out first. She did not merely walk out of the vehicle. She strutted onto my gravel driveway like a conquering general surveying her newly captured territory. She was wearing expensive designer sunglasses, a crisp white blouse, and holding a large iced coffee as if she had just arrived for a leisurely weekend vacation. There was absolutely no trace of guilt on her face. She looked around the property with an expression of pure, unadulterated entitlement. She pointed a manicured finger toward the detached garage, likely already dictating how she would repurpose my personal workspace for her own selfish needs. From the driver's side of the same truck, my son Lucas slowly stepped out. The contrast between his demeanor and his wife's arrogance was pathetic. While Victoria stood tall and proud, Lucas looked physically ill. He was wearing a casual polo shirt, but he was already sweating profusely in the cool morning air. His shoulders were slumped, and he kept his gaze fixed firmly on the gravel beneath his shoes. He looked exactly like a man who knew he was committing a terrible betrayal, but lacked the fundamental courage to stop it. He nervously wiped his forehead with the back of his hand and walked around the front of the truck to stand obediently behind his demanding wife. The doors of the second commercial truck opened next. Gerald and Patricia Higgins climbed down from the massive cab, complaining loudly before their feet even hit the ground. Gerald, a man drowning in $800,000 of unpayable debt, stretched his back and looked at my house as if he had built it himself. He confidently hooked his thumbs into his belt loops, admiring the wide bay windows and the expensive cedar siding. Patricia followed closely behind him, clutching an expensive designer handbag that was undoubtedly purchased on credit she would never repay. She immediately began pointing at the exterior of the house, her sharp, whining voice carrying clearly through the crisp morning air. I remained perfectly still inside the empty living room, watching their performance through the glass. They grouped together in the driveway, a unified front of parasites, ready to feast. Victoria clapped her hands together, issuing sharp instructions to her parents and my son. Then, as a collective unit, they turned and began to march directly toward my front porch. Their footsteps were heavy on the wooden stairs. I could hear Patricia already starting to complain about the aesthetic choices I had made for my own home. "This color is absolutely dreadful," Patricia whined loudly as she reached the top of the stairs, pointing directly at my heavy oak front door. "Who paints a door this dark? It completely ruins the welcoming energy of the house. We are going to have to hire a contractor to strip this wood down and repaint it a nice bright teal before the end of the month. I simply cannot look at this depressing color every single day." Gerald nodded in enthusiastic agreement. "We will get that sorted out right away, Patty," he assured her, with the unearned confidence of a man spending someone else's money. "We have a lot of work to do around here to get this place up to our standards. I think we should also expand this deck outward. It feels a little cramped for entertaining guests." I took a slow, deep breath, smoothing the front of my tailored suit jacket, and finally stepped forward. I grasped the brass handle of the front door and pulled it open, stepping out onto the porch to face them. The sudden opening of door startled Gerald, who took a quick step backward. Patricia stopped her complaining and stared at me. Lucas immediately looked down at his shoes, entirely unable to meet his father's eyes. But Victoria did not flinch. She stepped forward, standing at the very edge of the welcome mat, completely invading my personal space. She looked me up and down, taking in my charcoal gray Italian suit, my polished leather shoes, and my perfectly calm demeanor. She did not understand why I was dressed so formally for moving day. In her mind, I was supposed to be wearing old sweatpants, packing my belongings in defeat. Her confusion morphed back into that familiar, sickening sneer. She crossed her arms over her chest and looked at me with unfiltered contempt. "Did you move your junk to the basement yet?" Richard Victoria demanded, her voice sharp and dripping with absolute disrespect. "The professional movers are going to be here any minute. I told you that you needed to have the main floor completely cleared out by 8 o'clock this morning." I looked at Victoria standing on my porch, with her hands aggressively planted on her hips, her designer sunglasses pushed into her hair. The crisp air carried the heavy hum of the 2 commercial moving trucks idling right behind her in the gravel driveway. She was fully expecting a massive fight. She expected the flustered reaction of a defeated old man who finally realized he was entirely powerless to stop her hostile takeover. She wanted me to raise my voice, to beg for respect in my own home so she could roll her eyes and justify locking me away in a medical facility. Instead, I simply stood there wearing my tailored charcoal gray Italian suit, looking completely serene. The profound silence I offered her was not the silence of surrender. It was the absolute, unyielding silence of a concrete foundation that refuses to crack under extreme pressure. I did not step aside to let her into the house. I did not apologize for my presence. I looked past her shoulder at Lucas, who was still staring down at his leather shoes, physically trembling with the terrible weight of his own cowardly betrayal. Then I looked at Gerald and Patricia, who were already loudly whispering to each other about how they planned to remodel my property. My eyes slowly returned to Victoria. The arrogant sneer on her perfectly made-up face began to waver a fraction of an inch. My total lack of panic was confusing her. I slowly reached my hand inside the breast pocket of my suit jacket. The movement was highly deliberate and perfectly measured. I felt the smooth, heavy paper of the large legal envelope I had tucked away earlier that morning. I pulled it out and held it between us. It was a thick, white envelope bearing the official embossed seal of Thomas Thorne's corporate law firm in the upper left corner. I extended my hand, offering the heavy package directly to my daughter-in-law. Victoria stared at the envelope for a long second, her brow furrowing in deep confusion. She did not immediately reach out to take it. She glanced back at Lucas, silently demanding an explanation, but my son simply shook his head, looking completely lost. "Go ahead, Victoria," I said, my voice smooth and completely devoid of any grandfatherly warmth. "It is specifically for you." She snatched the thick envelope from my hand, with a sharp, highly irritated motion, as if taking it was a massive inconvenience to her highly important schedule. "What is this supposed to be, Richard?" she demanded, her voice shrill and entirely disrespectful. "Is this another list of your pathetic, ridiculous house rules? Because I already told you, we are not living by your outdated standards anymore. My parents are moving in today, and we do not have time for your childish games." I kept my hands casually clasped behind my back. I looked her directly in the eyes, watching the absolute arrogance radiating from her posture. "I remember a highly specific conversation we had exactly 1 week ago," I began, speaking in a highly controlled, incredibly precise tone that cut right through the mechanical noise of the idling, moving trucks. "You called me early on a Tuesday morning. You did not ask how I was doing. You did not politely request a favor. You loudly declared that your parents had lost their lease and were permanently moving into my private home." Victoria crossed her arms over her chest, clutching the heavy envelope against her crisp white blouse. "That is correct," she snapped arrogantly. "And here we are. So what exactly is your point, my point?" "Victoria, is that you gave me a very specific piece of advice during that same phone call," I continued, my voice remaining as cold and hard as structural steel. "You boldly told me that if I did not like your parents moving into my sanctuary, I should simply sell the house." I let those words hang heavily in the crisp morning air for a brief, agonizing moment. I watched as a tiny flicker of genuine uncertainty finally crossed her incredibly smug face. "I have always tried to be an agreeable, highly accommodating father-in-law," I said, taking one single incredibly slow step forward on the wooden porch. "I always take your advice, Victoria." The house was sold on Thursday. The profound silence that immediately followed my declaration was absolute and completely deafening. It was as if all the oxygen had been instantly sucked entirely out of the surrounding atmosphere. Victoria froze completely still, her eyes widening in massive, unadulterated shock. She looked exactly like a person who had just confidently stepped off a very high cliff, foolishly expecting to find solid ground, only to discover a terrifying, bottomless abyss waiting directly beneath her feet. "No," she whispered, her voice suddenly incredibly small and highly frantic. "That is absolutely impossible. You are completely lying. You cannot legally sell this property in 3 days." "Rip open the envelope," I calmly instructed her. "See the absolute truth for yourself." Victoria's manicured hands began to shake violently. She tore into the thick white paper with desperate, frantic energy, ripping the top of the heavy envelope completely to shreds. She pulled out the highly detailed, officially notarized legal documents. The thick stack of papers felt incredibly heavy in her trembling hands. It was the official, legally binding deed of absolute sale. She quickly flipped to the second page, her eyes frantically scanning the dense legal terminology, desperately searching for any technical loophole or obvious mistake. But Thomas Thorne did not make careless mistakes. His legal work was an impenetrable, highly fortified corporate fortress. She saw my official signature at the bottom. She saw the heavy stamp of the private county notary securely authenticating the massive financial transaction. And then she saw the name of the new official property owner, Apex Holdings, a limited liability company. Her face instantly drained of all color, turning a horrifying, sickly shade of absolute white. Lucas finally stepped forward, looking over her shoulder at the legal papers. He let out a choked, highly pathetic gasp of pure terror as he instantly recognized the catastrophic reality of their massive failure. But Gerald did not understand the dense corporate documents. He only understood that his fraudulent free ride was suddenly being directly threatened. He aggressively pushed past his heavily sweating son-in-law and stomped heavily onto the wooden steps of my front porch. Gerald's face turned a violent, highly volatile shade of dark red. His thick hands balled into tight, highly threatening fists at his sides. He tried to physically intimidate me, stepping directly into my personal space, his breathing incredibly heavy and reeking of stale morning coffee. "I am not going anywhere, you pathetic old fool," Gerald shouted at the absolute top of his lungs, completely losing his temper. "We already forwarded all of our important mail to this exact address. I have 3 final notices from the Internal Revenue Service sitting right inside your mailbox right now. Under state squatter rights and strict tenancy laws, we have firmly established legal residency. You absolutely cannot legally evict us from this property." I stood perfectly still on my front porch and let Gerald scream until his face turned purple. I was breathing heavily, his chest heaving, convinced he had delivered a checkmate. He believed memorizing a few lines from a state tenancy website made him an untouchable legal mastermind. I looked at the desperation, masking itself as confidence. Patricia stood behind him, nodding enthusiastically, clutching her designer handbag like a shield. Victoria had managed to pull her eyes away from the terrifying legal documents in her hands. She looked up at her father with a desperate, clinging hope. They were banking on the flawed assumption that residential housing laws were a magical barrier I could not cross. But an engineer knows every barrier has a specific breaking point. You just apply correct pressure. I did not argue with Gerald. I simply checked the gold watch on my wrist. It was exactly 8 in the morning. Right on cue, a deep rhythmic vibration began to shake the gravel of my driveway. It was a different sound than the heavy gears of their rented moving trucks. This was the smooth, powerful hum of a massive diesel engine. Gerald stopped his furious yelling, his jaw snapping shut as he turned toward the main road. Victoria and Patricia slowly followed his gaze, their eyes widening in sudden, profound confusion. A sleek black luxury charter bus was slowly turning off the main street and pulling directly onto the property. The enormous vehicle rolled smoothly up the gravel path, completely dwarfing their 2 rented trucks. It came to a graceful halt right behind them, effectively blocking the vehicles from moving anywhere. The heavy air brakes hissed loudly in the crisp morning air. The tinted doors of the massive bus swung open with a sharp mechanical hiss, and the serene atmosphere of my former sanctuary was instantly obliterated. First came the noise. A booming bass-heavy track blasted from a portable wireless speaker, echoing loudly across the calm waters of Lake Minnetonka. Then came the new tenants. A group of 20 young men, mostly in their mid-20s, began pouring out of the charter bus. They were wearing expensive casual clothes and designer sunglasses. They were boisterous, overflowing with the unbridled energy of tech developers celebrating a corporate victory. They began pulling heavy ice-filled coolers and large duffel bags from the luggage compartments of the bus. They were laughing, shouting over the loud music, and immediately treating the front yard as their own personal playground. Victoria stared at the scene unfolding on the grass, paralyzed by shock. "What is this?" she stammered, her voice barely audible over the heavy bass of the music. "Who are these people, Richard? Why is there a bus in the driveway?" "These are the paying clients," I replied calmly, my voice perfectly steady. Apex Holdings is a highly successful corporate short-term rental facility, Victoria. These young men have signed an exclusive ironclad commercial lease for the entire month. They paid a premium price to enjoy this property without any annoying residential neighbors, and they certainly did not pay to share their luxury party retreat with a bankrupt family. Gerald's face twisted into an ugly mask of pure rage. He completely ignored the crowd of young men and took another aggressive step toward me. "I do not care who you rented this place to," he roared, pointing a thick, trembling finger directly at my chest. "We have legal squatter rights. We have our personal mail forwarded here. You cannot just throw us out on the street to make room for a bunch of loud kids. I am going inside right now, and I am calling the local police." Gerald never took that final step toward my front door. Before he could even shift his weight forward, a massive, imposing shadow stepped smoothly and silently out of the charter bus and moved directly onto the wooden porch. It was Marcus, the head of the private security firm I had hired. He was easily 6 feet 4 inches tall. He wore a crisp black tactical uniform, a heavy utility belt, and an expression of absolute unyielding stone. He did not walk like a regular man. He moved with the highly calculated precision of a seasoned military enforcer. 3 other equally intimidating security guards flanked him immediately, forming an impenetrable human wall between my body and Gerald's aggressive advance. Marcus stepped directly into Gerald's personal space, forcing the red-faced man to instantly step backward. The sheer physical presence of the security chief was completely overwhelming. "You are not going inside this building, and you are certainly not calling the police to enforce residential squatter rights," Marcus stated. His voice was incredibly deep, highly professional, and completely devoid of any emotion. It was the voice of a man who did not negotiate under any circumstances. Gerald tried to puff out his chest, attempting to maintain his false bravado, but he looked completely pathetic. "I have rights," Gerald sputtered, though his voice had lost its booming volume, cracking slightly under the intense pressure of Marcus's cold stare. "I have official government mail delivered to this exact address. I am a legal resident." Marcus did not even blink. He reached into a leather tactical folder he was carrying and pulled out a laminated legal document. He held it up so Gerald and Victoria could clearly see the official county seals stamped across the heavy paper. "This property is legally zoned and officially registered as a commercial short-term rental facility owned by a corporate limited liability company." Marcus explained, his tone sharp and perfectly authoritative. "You are standing on private commercial property. Standard residential tenancy laws, including squatter rights, absolutely do not apply in any capacity to commercial hospitality facilities in this specific county. The legal rules simply vanish." Victoria gasped, her hands flying up to cover her mouth as the horrifying reality of my legal trap crushed her. She finally understood that I had not just sold the house. I had completely legally weaponized the very ground they were trying to steal. "You currently have absolutely no commercial lease." Marcus continued, his dark eyes locking intensely onto Gerald's sweating face. "You have no corporate authorization to be on these premises. Therefore, you are not considered tenants. You are legally classified as hostile intruders, committing an unauthorized commercial invasion. My security team has full legal authorization from the property owners to immediately remove any and all uninvited trespassers using whatever physical force is deemed necessary." Patricia let out a dramatic wail, clutching her husband's arm in pure panic. Lucas had retreated, completely pressing his back entirely against the cold metal siding of the rented U-Haul truck, staring at the ground in absolute pathetic defeat. Marcus checked a heavy tactical watch on his wrist, his expression hardening into pure steel. "I will give you exactly 5 minutes," he announced, his deep voice carrying clearly over the loud music. "You have 5 minutes to completely back out of this private driveway. If you are still on this corporate property, my team will physically restrain you, and you will be formally arrested for criminal trespassing. The timer starts now." The absolute finality in Marcus's deep voice hung in the crisp morning air, like a judge's gavel striking wood. For a brief agonizing second, nobody moved. The loud pulsing bass of the tech startup's portable speaker continued to thump across the front lawn, creating a bizarre, surreal soundtrack to the absolute destruction of Victoria's parasitic master plan. Then the sheer panic finally set in. Victoria completely lost what remained of her highly cultivated composure. She lunged forward, screaming hysterically at the imposing security guards, demanding to speak to the local authorities, threatening massive lawsuits, and loudly insisting that she had undeniable legal rights to enter the property. Marcus did not flinch. He simply crossed his massive arms over his chest, standing as an immovable wall of solid muscle and tactical discipline. When Gerald aggressively tried to step around the human barricade, two other security officers immediately stepped forward, placing their hands firmly on their heavy utility belts. The silent, undeniable threat of physical restraint was absolute. Gerald stopped dead in his tracks, his red face instantly draining of all color. He aggressively grabbed his wife by her arm, physically pulling Patricia back toward the rented commercial truck. The arrogant invaders were finally retreating, but my task was not quite finished yet. I turned my attention away from the screaming woman on the porch and looked for my son. Lucas had not moved a single inch. He was still pressing his back heavily against the cold metal siding of the massive U-Haul truck, trying desperately to blend into the shadows, trying to disappear entirely from this humiliating reality. He looked absolutely pathetic. The expensive designer suit he wore was completely soaked with nervous sweat, and his hands were trembling violently at his sides. I walked slowly down the wooden steps of my front porch, my leather shoes crunching softly against the gravel driveway. I did not rush. I moved with the calm, measured pace of a structural engineer inspecting the final, devastating results of a perfectly executed demolition. As I approached him, Lucas could not even bring himself to look me in the eye. He kept his gaze firmly fixed on the dusty stones beneath his expensive shoes, his breathing shallow and rapid. I stopped just 2 feet away from him, letting the heavy silence stretch between us for a long, agonizing moment. The loud music and Victoria's frantic screaming faded into the background, leaving only the profound, suffocating weight of my son's absolute failure. I slowly reached inside the breast pocket of my tailored suit jacket one final time. I bypassed my leather wallet and pulled out a completely different set of legal papers. These were not the corporate property deeds I had just handed to his arrogant wife. This was a highly detailed, comprehensive financial audit, meticulously compiled by Thomas Thorne's investigative team. The thick stack of white paper was neatly bound with a heavy metal clip, summarizing every single disastrous financial decision my son had secretly made over the past several months. I held the heavy stack of documents out toward him. "Take it, Lucas," I instructed him, my voice completely stripped of any grandfatherly warmth, remaining steady and unforgiving. He hesitated, his trembling fingers hovering over the paper, before he finally grasped the thick bundle. He looked down at the top page, his eyes frantically scanning the dense columns of numbers, bank account routing details, and outstanding loan balances. I watched as the absolute realization of his complete financial ruin began to slowly register in his mind. "I know absolutely everything about the massive second mortgage you secretly took out on your own house, Lucas." I stated, my voice cutting through the crisp air with clinical precision. "I know that you deliberately submitted falsified income documents to your bank, committing federal mortgage fraud, just to secure enough liquid cash to pay off the massive outstanding debts of Gerald and Patricia Higgins. I know that you completely drained your personal savings, liquidated your retirement accounts, and effectively bankrupted your entire future." Lucas let out a pathetic, choked gasp, his knees visibly buckling under the crushing weight of my words. He tried to speak, tried to formulate some kind of weak, cowardly excuse, but his vocal cords completely failed him. He simply stood there, clutching the devastating financial audit, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. "But the financial betrayal is not even the worst part, son." I continued, stepping slightly closer to him, forcing him to finally look up into my cold, unyielding eyes. The money is just numbers on a page. The truly sickening reality is why you stole it. You bankrupted yourself and destroyed your entire future for a deeply manipulative woman who was actively planning to lock me away in a state-run nursing home, I said, delivering the final catastrophic blow. I sat quietly on the front porch on Thursday afternoon, Lucas. I sat there, and I listened to every single word your wife said on speakerphone to her mother. I heard the entire parasitic master plan. I know she was meticulously planning to establish fake residential residency, falsely claim I was suffering from severe cognitive decline, steal my legal medical proxy, and completely erase my existence from this earth so she could live a life of luxury inside my beautiful sanctuary. You sold your soul, your financial freedom, and your own father to appease a monster who never cared about you at all. She only cared about what resources she could easily extract from your absolute weakness. The immediate impact of the absolute truth was utterly devastating to witness firsthand. The final lingering illusion of his marriage completely shattered in his mind. Lucas let out a broken, agonizing sob, his legs finally giving out completely beneath him. He collapsed heavily onto his knees in the sharp gravel, the expensive fabric of his tailored suit tearing against the rough stones. He dropped the thick stack of financial documents, letting the white pages scatter across the dusty driveway. He looked up at Victoria, who was still loudly cursing at the imposing security guards on the porch, her face twisted into an ugly mask of pure, selfish rage. In that singular, terrifying moment, my son finally saw his demanding wife for the absolute monster she truly was. He finally saw the cold, unyielding reality of his own catastrophic choices. I looked down at the broken man kneeling in the dirt, feeling absolutely no remaining sorrow, no pity, and no fatherly warmth. I had successfully protected my quiet sanctuary, my personal dignity, and my hard-earned peace of mind today. I adjusted my silk tie, turned my back on his weeping form, and walked smoothly toward my parked vehicle. I quickly climbed into the comfortable driver's seat, started the quiet engine, and slowly drove away. As I slowly turned my vehicle onto the main road, I looked deeply into my rearview mirror one final time. I watched with profound satisfaction as Marcus and his highly trained security team physically forced the two massive commercial U-Haul trucks to aggressively reverse back out into the public street, completely banishing the arrogant invaders from my property forever. We fast-forward exactly 1 month from that chaotic Saturday morning on the gravel driveway. The loud pulsing bass of the portable speakers and the frantic screaming of my arrogant daughter-in-law have long faded into the quiet echoes of the past. The corporate party retreat has officially ended. The 20 energetic tech developers packed up their expensive beer coolers and boarded their luxury charter bus, leaving my former cedar wood sanctuary behind. I did not return to the main property to inspect the aftermath. That house belongs to a faceless corporation now. I have happily moved into my much smaller, incredibly peaceful secondary cabin on the far north side of the lake. This rustic little house is hidden deep within a thick grove of ancient pine trees. It is completely invisible from the main highway and entirely disconnected from the toxic web of deceit that my own family tried to spin around me. I spent the first few weeks slowly unpacking the cardboard boxes I had transported in the rental van. I carefully unrolled our antique wool rugs across the worn hardwood floors. I placed my late wife's silver-framed photographs along the stone mantelpiece above the burning fireplace. Every single item I placed in this small space felt like planting a new seed in uncontaminated soil. The suffocating weight of betrayal has been entirely replaced by a profound, unyielding tranquility. Apex Holdings continues to operate smoothly without my direct daily involvement. The private property management team handles the new commercial tenants, ensuring that the heavy oak front door remains permanently locked to anyone attempting a fraudulent residential invasion. I am simply a silent shareholder, enjoying the quiet dividends of my calculated demolition. It was a crisp Tuesday afternoon when my cell phone broke the serene silence of the forest. I was sitting on the wooden dock watching the gentle ripples of the water when the screen illuminated with Thomas Thorne's name. I answered the call fully expecting a routine update on our corporate tax filings. Instead, my ruthless attorney called to deliver the final devastating financial autopsy of my former family. Richard Thomas began, his voice carrying that familiar sharp edge of professional satisfaction. I thought you would like to know the exact current status of the individuals who attempted to occupy your commercial facility last month. I leaned back in my wooden chair and told him to proceed. The news regarding my son was exactly as grim as I had calculated. The bank officially discovered the falsified income documents Lucas had submitted to secure that massive second mortgage. They did not show him a single ounce of mercy. The foreclosure proceedings were initiated immediately. Lucas was formally evicted from the home he had shared with his demanding wife. He lost absolutely everything he had spent his entire adult life building. The crushing weight of absolute financial ruin finally broke the spell Victoria had cast over him. Thomas informed me that Lucas had officially filed for divorce 2 weeks ago. He is currently sleeping in a rented cot in a cramped basement apartment downtown, desperately trying to negotiate with federal prosecutors to avoid serving prison time for mortgage fraud. He is completely ruined, hollowed out by the parasitic demands of a woman who never truly loved him. I listened to this tragic reality without shedding a single tear. When a man actively chooses to help strangers build a trap for his own father, he completely forfeits his right to parental sympathy. Lucas built his own prison cell. Now he must live inside it. I asked Thomas about the arrogant invaders Gerald and Patricia Higgins. Thomas let out a low, cold laugh. Without Lucas's stolen money to act as a protective shield, the aggressive collection agencies out of Chicago finally cornered them. The Internal Revenue Service moved swiftly, seizing whatever meager assets they still possessed. Their grand master plan, to establish permanent legal residency in my luxury lake house and live comfortably off my life savings, had been completely obliterated. Without a single dollar to their names, and with their credit scores entirely destroyed, they had absolutely nowhere left to hide. They were unceremoniously thrown out into the cold, unforgiving reality of their massive, unpayable debt. Victoria's parents are currently residing in a remarkably cheap, rundown motel located right next to a noisy interstate highway on the very edge of the county. Thomas described the squalid conditions with clinical precision. It is the kind of damp, decaying establishment that charges by the week, featuring flickering neon signs and stained carpets. Patricia, the woman who had loudly complained about the color of my expensive front door and demanded a luxury spa bathroom with a soaking tub, now shares a cramped, moldy bathroom with a broken shower head. Gerald, who had aggressively shouted at my security team about his fake tenant rights, now spends his days hiding behind thin curtains, terrified of the debt collectors knocking on his door. And then there is Victoria, the arrogant architect of the entire parasitic takeover. The woman who had strutted onto my gravel driveway in expensive designer sunglasses, clutching an iced coffee, and expecting me to surrender my territory without a fight. When Lucas's fraudulent funds completely dried up, her luxurious lifestyle instantly vanished. She could no longer rely on her husband's stolen wealth, and she certainly could not turn to her bankrupt parents for shelter. Thomas revealed that she is currently living out of a single suitcase, desperately crashing on the lumpy couch of a former college friend who is already growing tired of her constant complaining. Her perfect, meticulously cultivated facade has been completely and utterly shattered. The high heels, the manicured nails, the sneering condescension have all been entirely stripped away by the brutal force of absolute poverty. She has been calling Thomas's corporate office every single day for the past week, leaving frantic voicemails begging for a chance to speak with me, offering hollow apologies, and desperately asking for a small financial loan to get back on her feet. Thomas, operating under my strict instructions, simply blocks her numbers and ignores her pathetic pleas. She is completely isolated, drowning in the exact same dark, lonely abyss she had so coldly prepared for my twilight years. She has absolutely nothing left to exploit. I thanked Thomas for his highly efficient legal work and ended the phone call. I placed the cell phone face down on the wooden planks of the dock. The gentle breeze rustled the pine needles above my head, carrying the fresh, clean scent of the Minnesota wilderness. I closed my eyes and took a deep, steadying breath. The demolition was officially complete. The structural rot that had threatened to collapse my entire existence had been surgically removed and permanently incinerated. I did not feel a triumphant, explosive joy. I felt something much more valuable. I felt absolute, undeniable closure. The toxic infection was gone, and the healthy tissue of my life could finally begin to heal. The storm has completely passed, the dust has finally settled, and my peaceful twilight years belong to absolutely no one else but me. It is a beautiful day on the quiet lake. The early morning sun is a brilliant, burning gold as it rises over the quiet northern edge of Lake Minnetonka. I am sitting in a wooden folding chair at the very end of my private dock. The air is crisp and completely clean, carrying the sharp, familiar scent of ancient pine trees and cold, fresh water. I slowly reach back and cast my fishing line deep into the calm, glassy surface of the water. The nylon thread makes a soft, satisfying slicing sound as it breaks the surface, sending ripples expanding outward in perfect concentric circles. I watch those gentle ripples slowly fade away until the lake is perfectly still once again. There is no one else around for miles. The profound silence that surrounds my small, rustic cabin is not the heavy, suffocating silence of a house infected with lies and deceit. It is the absolute, restorative silence of true freedom. I lean back in my chair, holding the fishing rod loosely in my hands, and take a long, deep breath. The suffocating weight that had been pressing down on my chest for months has completely vanished. It has been 4 weeks since I walked away from my former property, leaving the highly arrogant invaders to face a strict corporate eviction. The massive cedar wood house is no longer my concern. Apex Holdings continues to manage the short-term rental facility with absolute, ruthless efficiency. The loud tech startup finished their party retreat, immediately replaced by another high-paying corporate group. I do not drive past that neighborhood anymore. I have legally and emotionally severed my connection to that physical space. A house is simply a temporary container made of wood, glass, and concrete. It only becomes a true sanctuary when the people inside share a foundation built on mutual respect and absolute honesty. The moment my son and his demanding wife decided to weaponize that space against me, it became a battlefield. And now that the war is permanently over, I have safely retreated to the only territory that truly matters. Here at this small, hidden cabin, the atmosphere is entirely different. There is absolutely no screaming, echoing across the front yard. There are no massive commercial moving trucks rumbling up my gravel driveway to announce a hostile takeover. There are no fake, overly sweet smiles masking a sinister plot to lock me away in a medical facility. There are no frantic, whispered arguments in a detached garage. The only sounds that fill my days now are the gentle, rhythmic lapping of the cold lake water against the wooden posts of my dock. The occasional sharp cry of a distant loon hunting for its morning meal, and the soft, steady rustling of the cold wind blowing through the surrounding pine trees. It is a completely organic, uncorrupted symphony. Every single morning I wake up when the sun naturally crests the horizon. I brew a strong pot of dark roast coffee, pour it into a ceramic mug, and step out onto the back porch to watch the forest slowly come alive. Nobody tells me what I am allowed to do. Nobody demands that I retreat to the damp basement. My thoughts inevitably drift toward my son, Lucas. A father does not simply erase the memory of his only child without a profound, lingering sense of sorrow. I remember the honest little boy who used to help me carry heavy steel tools in my workshop. But that young man is entirely gone. He allowed his character to be eroded by a highly manipulative woman. He chose cowardice, choosing to steal from his future, commit mortgage fraud, and actively conspire to destroy his father. When a load-bearing pillar is completely compromised by internal rot, you cannot patch the surface. You must remove the infected pillar entirely. I amputated the toxic infection to save my own soul. I feel pity for the miserable reality he created for himself, but absolutely no guilt for allowing him to face the devastating consequences of his terrible choices. Society feeds us a highly dangerous narrative about family. We are conditioned early to believe that sharing genetic material or signing a marriage certificate requires infinite forgiveness. We are told to turn the other cheek, to endlessly accommodate selfish demands simply because they are blood. But tolerating calculated malicious abuse is not an act of nobility. It is an act of profound self-destruction. Cutting off toxic family members is not a tragedy to be mourned. It is the ultimate necessary act of self-preservation. Victoria and her bankrupt parents viewed my own kindness as a vulnerability. They looked at my lifetime of hard work and saw a free, luxurious retirement fund waiting to be stolen. They fundamentally misunderstood the core mechanics of the man they were trying to betray. I am a structural engineer. I spend my life ensuring that foundations are solid and capable of bearing massive weight. When I discovered their deceit, I simply removed my support, stepped back, and watched their fraudulent parasitic structure completely collapse under its own unsustainable gravity. I reel my fishing line back in, feeling the slight resistance of the water against the small metal lure. There is no fish on the hook today, but I am not disappointed at all. I am not out here on the dock to catch anything. I am simply out here to exist perfectly in the moment. I set the fishing rod down on the wooden planks and pick up my ceramic mug, taking a slow sip of the dark, bitter coffee. The morning air is warming up, melting the lingering chill from my shoulders. I look back over my shoulder at the small rustic cabin nestled securely among the tall pines. Through the front window, I can see the silver-framed photographs of my late wife, Martha, sitting safely on the stone mantelpiece above the fireplace. I know she would completely understand why I had to do what I did. She would be proud I did not allow myself to be discarded and erased. She would be happy that I finally found the quiet, undisturbed peace we always dreamed of sharing in our twilight years. The days ahead of me are entirely my own. I have no urgent corporate schedules to follow, no ungrateful relatives to constantly appease, and no massive financial burdens draining my hard-earned life savings. I plan to spend the upcoming winter reading the large stack of classic novels I have been ignoring for decades. I plan to repair the old wooden boat tied to the side of the dock. I plan to sit right here in this exact folding chair and watch the seasons slowly change across the beautiful expanse of the pristine lake. I have successfully defended my territory, secured my remaining assets, and reclaimed my fundamental human dignity. The arrogant invaders have been permanently banished to the miserable, chaotic lives they fully deserve. The storm has completely passed. The dust from the highly calculated demolition has finally settled, and the foundation of my new life is absolutely unbreakable. It is a beautiful, deeply peaceful day on the quiet lake, and I am truly home. If there is one thing surviving this betrayal has taught me, it is that family is a title earned through respect, not a free pass granted by blood or marriage. When people show you their true colors, do not close your eyes. Believe them the very first time. We spend our entire lives building a sanctuary, sacrificing our own comfort to provide for our children. But generosity without boundaries is simply a vulnerability waiting to be exploited. Protect your peace fiercely. You owe no one your sanity, your dignity, or your home. True love never demands your own ultimate destruction. Did this story resonate with you? Please let me know which city you are watching from and what time it is there right now. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share your own experiences in the comments below. See you in the next life story. Stay strong.